Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us tonight for the EAWCP webinar series. We're really excited that you're all joining us. Tonight, we have Kristen Weidus with us to present. We want to welcome and thank Attorney Kristen Weidus for taking the time to join us for this evening's webinar. Kristen Weidus is a partner at Reuter Law, where she focuses her practice on education and disability rights law. Kristen also manages the firm's federal practice, where she represents students and their families discriminated against because of race, sex, gender identity, disability, and otherwise. As a resident of Greensburg, Kristen remains active in the Westmoreland Bar Association, currently serving on its board of directors, co-chairing its Women in Law Committee, and formally chairing the Young Lawyers Committee and Membership Committee. She received the Westmoreland Bar Association's Outstanding Young Lawyers Award in 2016 and currently serves as a Zone 6 delegate in the Pennsylvania Bar Association's House of Delegates. Kristen graduated magna cum laude from the University of the District of Columbia David A. Clark School of Law in Washington, D.C. in 2012. She worked as a law student attorney in the Took Crowell Institute for At-Risk Youth, representing students with disabilities enrolled in the D.C. public schools. Kristen is licensed to practice in the state courts of Ohio and Pennsylvania, the United States District Courts of the Western and Eastern Districts of Pennsylvania, as well as the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. So once again, we want to welcome Kristen Weidus. And just a couple notes before she begins. We ask that if you do have a question throughout the presentation, if you could just raise your hand on the screen. There's a little hand raising reaction at the bottom, and we will answer your questions throughout. And then if you would like to receive Act 48 credits for tonight's presentation, we do have that available. We will provide a post survey at the end for you to fill out to get credit for attending. So thank you once again, Kristen, and take it away.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks everybody for joining tonight. I know 6 o'clock, there's a lot of other things you could be doing, so I'm going to do my best to make this as exciting and also informative. Also, like they mentioned, please feel free to jump in with questions. If you don't feel comfortable raising your hand, I think there's a chat feature at the bottom too. We'll also be monitoring, so we'll read questions from there as well. I'm here to talk about the keys to an appropriate IEP and 504 plan, but also to just kind of cover things that I have found in my years of practice can be helpful advocating in IEP or 504 plan meetings. And then to the extent that we are able to get to it or we have questions on it, I just have some helpful tips for some other things that you have a right to access as parents or advocates or individuals that are working with parents or advocates of children with disabilities in schools. Let's see if perfect. Okay. So first and foremost, IEPs. What is an IEP? Likely, many of you know this already, and I never know coming in what the level of knowledge the group that I have is going to have. So forgive me if some of this feels really basic, but I'll just try to cover things like that kind of quickly. But an IEP is an individualized education program. Basically, that's like the roadmap for the education that a student with a disability will receive at school. It's not a one-size-fits-all document, which is really important. It's the set of services, set of educational programs that help that child or young adult access the free, appropriate public education that they're entitled to. This will include things like goals that allow the family to monitor the progress that student's making in school. This will also include things like related services. We'll talk about all of these things later one by one, but things like speech and language supports, occupational therapy, things like that. It will also include things that sometimes seem surprising to families, like supports for teachers and staff that will help that student access their education. So consult services for staff. For students that have complicated needs, this can be really important. But additionally, for children that have complicated medical needs, or in this case, children with epilepsy, you can have things like medical plans embedded into these documents too. Oftentimes I find that school districts will talk to families about medical plans as if they're separate documents from IEPs. They can be, but you have every right to ask for them to be included too. We can talk about that later. But the individualized education program, or when we get to 504 plans, the 504 plan is really kind of that roadmap for what that student is going to get throughout the day. Here, I just have a little slide that kind of lets you see the distinction between 504 plans and IEPs at a very basic level, because there are two different laws that govern the IEP versus the 504 plan, which we're not going to get into, the statutory citations or any of those things today. But the most important thing to remember is that IEPs are governed by a law called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And Section 504 is the law that governs 504 plans, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. This is important only because if you're looking for more information after today, you can simply put something like that in Google, and there are great resources for parents out there. I'm sure, the Epilepsy Foundation puts out a lot of great things that you can find on their website that distinguish these two also, but there's a plethora of things out there. So if you're a student that qualifies under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and you can get that IEP, like I mentioned, that's a legal document that has the plan for the student's day, which is the same as the 504 plan. It's a legal document that plans the student's day, but it will lay out what the school provides in terms of things like specially designed instruction, changes to the way that curriculum is delivered, modifications, academic supports, goals that are measurable that track a student's progress. Whereas a 504 plan, that will not include things that require the district, the school, to modify the delivery of instruction. That's a key difference. It will include things instead like accommodations or academic support. It's easiest to think about at the very basic level that a 504 plan allows students to access programming as opposed to the programming being changed at its core level for the student to be able to access it. So initially, one of the easiest examples or the easiest ways to think about a distinction between a 504 plan and an IEP really is that you're not going to typically see students with 504 plans needing to have access to special education classrooms traditionally. 504 plans typically give students with disabilities access to the regular education classroom, whereas students with IEPs, sometimes they're enabling students to have access to the regular education classroom. That's certainly the goal, but there are a wide range of special education options within schools, different kinds of special education environments where IEPs can be implemented. Sorry, I have to click this to move forward. All right, now I mentioned originally, I think, just briefly, that an IEP is intended to provide students access to a free, appropriate public education. You'll hear advocates, lawyers, parents that are dealing with these things a lot use the catchphrase FAPE. That stands for Free Appropriate Public Education. This is true both under Section 504 and under the IDEA. Students are entitled to a free appropriate public education under both laws. However, the citations and things that I have included here are specific to the IDEA for students with IEPs. And the important thing to remember when you're talking about a free appropriate public education and you're advocating for one on behalf of a child with a disability is that the educational document, the instrument that is providing them with that education must be reasonably calculated to enable that student to make progress in light of their unique circumstances. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all program. It is intended to include the services and supports that that student needs to make progress and to access their educational program. I mentioned that an IEP will contain goals. Again, depending on where you are in the process with the students that you're working with your children, you know that, you've seen them. But they're supposed to be written in such a way that the progress monitoring data that you as a parent get from those goals is quantifiable, which means it has to be understandable. It has to be written in such a way that actual data can be collected and provided to you so that you can participate as a member of the team every year at minimum. But if you want to meet more often, you can. Passing grades, that's not enough. That doesn't mean that a student is being provided a free, appropriate public education. Meaningful educational benefit is the key. There's additional court cases that interpreted what it means to provide a free, appropriate public education further. I've cited two of those there. It's important that, for example, the program be tailored to the unique individual needs of the child. Again, that's pretty similar to what's included in Andrew F. It just makes it a little bit more clear, I think. And it must be designed to offer the child the opportunity to make progress in all relevant domains of FAPE, or domains under the IDA. And I mention this here because I think it's very important for us to talk about, because oftentimes I see and I'm contacted by families of students in particular that have medical needs, like children with epilepsy, who are told that because of that medical need, they can't participate in something like a field trip, like a gym class, like something else, because either they need a nurse, they need something that makes it more difficult for the school to make that particular activity accessible. That's not okay. Students are entitled to make progress in all of the different domains, one of which is social. So making certain that a student has access to all of the same things that are key components of the educational program of a typically developing student. And I put typically developing in quotation marks. That's something that we use as a standard under the law, but what the heck does typically developing mean, right? But what the regular education peer would be entitled to. So in other words, if your child is in class with their peers and a field trip is being offered, they can't be left out of that simply because they have some other complicated medical need. They're entitled to access those types of things too. But additionally, if your child has behavioral or emotional needs, which sometimes come from different types of disabilities, not just the typical ones that we see attributed to behaviors like ADHD, for example. Sometimes students that are pulled out of school a lot for medical appointments will then develop behaviors because they struggle with the transition back. That's still something that's related to a disability. That child is entitled to have that programmed for, and there should be goals included in the IEP to allow that to be monitored and progress to be made in that area and supported. So that's why I include this case citation here too. Because as a parent, I think that, or an advocate, it's key that you understand that, so that at an IEP meeting, at a 504 meeting, you can ask questions about what in an IEP context is being done to progress monitor and ensure that a student is making strides in that area. But in a 504 context, what's being done to ensure that a student has access to all of those areas like their peers. Okay. I include this slide because sometimes I hear families frustrated when they come to meet with me for the first time because, for example, their IEP team meetings don't seem to be very productive. The same requirements for IEP team meetings are not identical to 504 team meetings, in the sense that there isn't anything in the code that says these exact people have to be at a 504 team meeting, but there's no reason that you can't ask for the same people to be there. So I still suggest that you consider having the same group at the table. It's just that from an IDEA perspective, you are entitled to have these people at the table. So at least one regular education teacher, one special education teacher, a representative of the school district who's, quote, qualified to provide or supervise the provision of special education instruction to meet the unique needs of children with disabilities. The key there is that there has to be someone there who is able to basically allocate resources of the school district. That means that they can't have an IEP team meeting where they say to you, we're going to have to go talk to somebody who has more decision-making authority than the people we have at this meeting. You need to be able to get real answers and real decisions made from the group that's there. An individual who can interpret the instructional implications of an evaluation. This means school psychologists most of the time, or for example, if you had a behavior evaluation done, a behavior consultant could be that person, speech therapist, depending on the assessment done. The child, when appropriate, in Pennsylvania, we typically start seeing, I should know this off the top of my head, it's typically 14, but if your child is, if you want to have your child there earlier, you can request that. If you think that your child shouldn't be there even when they are old enough to attend by statute, for portions of the meeting, you can request that they come later. There is a value to be added for children to be there in certain circumstances, obviously, so that they can participate in talks about accommodations if they're going to be reluctant to have them included. Certainly when transition starts being discussed, they should be there. But if you know that there's going to be a difficult discussion around behaviors that are happening in a classroom, for example, and you don't want them to have to hear a teacher talking about something tough, you can ask for a student to be included after that part of the discussion. And then this is the important piece I like to bring up. Others who have knowledge or special expertise regarding a student. This means that you can invite anyone that you want to the IEP meeting, essentially, or a 504 team meeting. So if you have a medical provider that is worked closely with you and your child that you think has important information for the school, you can invite them. And because the school is also required to convene an IEP team meeting or a 504 meeting at a time that is convenient for you, and a place and a method. So it can be virtual, it can be by phone. If your medical provider is only able to participate by phone or video, that's also fine. And again, for students with complicated medical situations, it can be really important for these medical providers to have a voice. So oftentimes I see that people are bringing letters from their medical providers because things are, in particular for students with epilepsy, medically necessary often that need to be added to the plan. And districts will say things like, well, we have follow-up questions, we need to do this. And parents are hesitant, understandably, to let those conversations happen without them in the room. One way to make sure that this doesn't happen is to invite them to the IEP team meetings and to have things scheduled around that doctor's schedule. Also, excuse me, I'm getting over being sick, so I feel like I'm struggling sometimes here to breathe and I need to cough, so pardon me. Yeah, haven't had to talk this much since I've been coming down from this virus or whatever this is that's going around. All right. So I mentioned the IEP team meetings and who needs to be invited, but also one of the keys is that parents are entitled to meaningfully participate. And one of the main reasons that I get approached by families is that they feel like they've been left out of the process, or they don't understand something, or they are provided with data in the form of progress monitoring on goals that doesn't make sense to them. All of those things are a problem because the law is very clear that not only does the meeting have to be scheduled at a time and place that's convenient for a family so they can physically participate, but things have to be given in the form that is accessible to the family, whether that means having an interpreter there or having something printed in a different language. But also, they can't just give you progress monitoring data that is meaningless in terms of the information included. So a bunch of numbers that are unclear could only be deciphered by somebody that's an expert. Those types of things are not acceptable. The law is very clear on this. That could arguably be considered something that is being provided that's even misleading on the district's part, because we'll often see a bunch of regurgitated numbers and then underneath something like a summary from the teacher that just says like Johnny is making good progress, which is probably provided with good intention. But if that's not really an accurate reflection of what the numbers above show, that's misleading information for a parent, because what they're relying on is the teacher is giving them the truth, not that that's really just, a teacher trying to be kind about what is in fact information that suggests the exact opposite. So there's a lot of good case law out there about that. But the thing is, oops, sorry. I mentioned this because if you are ever in a meeting and that information is provided to you in such a way that it feels like that, you should feel comfortable and you have every right to ask them to slow down and explain that data to you in a way that makes sense. What I find is that often they can't explain it either, which suggests that the goal needs to be rewritten in such a way that everybody can understand it. Because, teachers are busy. Teachers have a lot of students. Teachers sometimes don't, I think, realize until they are asked to slow down and interpret that out loud that something doesn't really make sense. 9 out of 10 times, 30% of the time, 6 out of 7 days a week, you're like, none of this makes any sense, So it's perfectly acceptable to acknowledge that something is confusing. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, that's a perfect time to reach out to someone like here at this organization or an advocate somewhere else that can walk you through the best way to do that. because the schools are required to make sure that you understand what's being provided. All right, this is just a list of the sections of the IEP, and I include it so that if in circumstances where we're talking more than an hour, we can go through them here kind of step by step, but we're going to hit each of these things as we go through. So this is just a helpful resource so you know what to expect in the document. These are the initial questions that every IEP team has to ask in determining where and how they're going to structure a program for a student. If there are behaviors that impede that student's learning, they have to talk about positive behavior support. If the student has limited English proficiency, that's important. They need to include those types of supports, communication needs, or assistive technology. We can talk about each of those in turn here too, but that's just right at the beginning. And the reason that that's important is some of those things, in the event that they interfere with the student's learning, can also impact what disability category the student qualifies under. If you have specific questions about that, I'm glad to talk about that even like outside of this. It's not typically super relevant for students with epilepsy because they'll likely qualify somewhere else too under another category. And once you qualify under the law, the schools are required to provide your student all supports that are necessary for them to access their programming. So the category that you qualify under actually isn't the most important thing. But those are, important factors for families to consider when they're struggling to get an identification. So, okay, one of the first sections of the IEP that I like to talk about, which is absent from a 504 plan, but is a useful section for parents to pay attention to and is often skimmed over in IEP meetings, is the present levels of academic achievement. And when I say skimmed over, it's skimmed over in this way. This is the section where the district will include a lot of information about the present levels of the students' achievement at school. Things like classroom-based assessments, things that, the positives and negatives that the teachers are seeing the student perform. But one of the things that this is also useful for is it's a great place, excuse me, for parents to document their concerns in real time. So IEPs are living documents. If you as a parent, in first grade are concerned about bullying, are concerned about, your child's reading, are concerned about a particular instance, there was a particular issue in school that year surrounding a nurse or something, you can ask the district and they have to include the information that you provide as parent feedback in the parent concern sections of the present levels of academic achievement. This is really important because it will live there then in perpetuity because districts will just continue to add on to the IEP. So it's a good place to capture concerns, not just for yourself, but for an advocate for counsel in the future in the event that it gets to that point, but also just to continue to help yourself remember what has occurred, because really districts are the ones that control the records, and this is not from like a negative or vindictive sense. They just are the ones that are the keepers of the documents here. And as parents, you have so many things that you have to keep track of. Why not use this parent concern section of the IEP as a place to capture stuff in real time and make sure that it's there then next year and you can add on it each time. Often parents are, understandably so busy that they don't utilize this section in the meeting. They will transcribe it in real time. Just share your concerns, share the things that you want to make sure are captured, and have them write it down here. Next section there in the IEP is where the team will talk about strengths and areas of concern. The main point that is important to capture here is that everything that is listed in the areas of concern section has to be programmed for in the annual IEP, whether that is in the form of a goal, specially designed instruction, or related services and supports. So if you have a concern about something for your child, you want to push hard to make sure that it is included in the areas of concern section in some capacity, because that will make certain that the district is required to program for it in some official way in the IEP itself. Okay, so these are some of the things that over the years I have helped, I've seen, and I've also helped families list just kind of as broad things as areas of concern in that section for students with epilepsy. So then we're talking about kind of broad programming things. And it's stuff that is non-traditional that you're not necessarily going to see captured then in like the medical plan portion of an IEP. So again, these are very broad examples, but really the important thing to remember is that you don't have to limit yourself to things that are obvious to people unfamiliar with anything about epilepsy beyond seizures, right? You can, and this is another reason to bring a medical person with you or an advocate or someone who knows your child, knows their profile. These things are related to the disability. Include them here. They must program for them. Um, you are you as the parent will know your child best when it comes to these types of things, right? That the school may not understand when they see issues in the classroom are directly related to your child's epilepsy. They might attribute it to something else, like attention and concentration problems. There might be a misdiagnosis or a referral for an ADHD assessment that comes back nothing, and they will not program for that, but for, you helping them make the connection to this need instead. So this is why I mentioned this here. There is nothing that prevents you as a parent from bringing up these concerns and forcing the district to look at it through a different lens. Excuse me. Okay, I mentioned previously when it's important for students to begin attending IEP meetings, and one of the key times to participate is when a student is of transition age at 14. This is just the section of the IEP. This is the time that we would talk about transition more broadly. That's why I hit this here. Transition technically should be the section of an IEP that is really driving the rest of the programming by the time the student is turning 14, right? Because the goal overall is to make sure that the programming provided to students is enabling them to be successful in not just school, but beyond, right? So the school should be doing things like assessments to help determine what that student's interests are, what their strengths are, what needs they might have to be successful post graduation in their chosen career. What's a realistic career for them to do? Not just listing things in the IEP like Johnny will go visit a vocational program, Johnny will fill out a resume. There needs to be more there. In fact, transition goals should be written in the same way as the goals in the rest of the IEP, measurably specific with things you can see in terms of progress that arguably should be changed every year as the child meets that goal and then can move on to something different. You have a right as a parent to push for the inclusion of realistic goals for your child. Not, again, these very simplistic things like Johnny will live independently with no means to give Johnny the skills to achieve that goal. Also, OVR is a resource we have in Pennsylvania, the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, that provides services and supports for students, individuals with disabilities post high school. School districts are supposed to invite them to attend IEP meetings. They often will, but there's long wait lists for OVR. You as a parent also have a right to reach out to them and invite them to the IEP meeting. Traditionally, school districts have one rep that is tied to their school. You can get that person's name and also try to create, make a relationship, build a relationship with that person yourself while your student is in school, so that post graduation, it's an easy transition continuing to work with them, and they can attend IEP meetings with you. It's just a question of working with the district to try to schedule meetings around the time that person's available. It's not something we prioritize enough, in my opinion. It's almost as if OVR is an afterthought as to whether or not they'll be available for students' meetings because they are so backlogged, but they can be extremely helpful. And they do have a lot of really important services and opportunities for students that we should be trying to tap into. Okay. So another section of the IEP, but also just something that's important for us to talk about as people that are advocating for parents of individuals with disabilities, are the standardized tests that students are asked to take in Pennsylvania. You are students are entitled to accommodations on those standardized tests as well, depending on the type of disability, the type of needs that they have. Some of the examples here are extended time, small group settings, manipulatives, scribes, breaks, all of the things that you traditionally think of when you think of accommodations on standardized tests. Now, one of the other things, though, is, and I mention this only because I know some people like me think that standardized tests are probably not that valuable. There is an exemption in Pennsylvania that still exists. It's a religious exemption, where if you say that you disagree with standardized tests for religious reasons, they will let you see the test and then opt your child out. You can explore that, and it's not something that negatively impacts your child's ability to graduate. This is not something that is unique for children with disabilities, but I have lots of clients that ask me to help them do that simply because they don't want their child to have to sit through this assessment, any of these assessments. So I mentioned that here just because it is something that, again, it's a really easy Google, and most districts don't make problems for parents that want to take that step. Excuse me. Okay. Now getting back to the measurable annual goals that we've sort of danced around a little bit.
Kristen?
Yeah.
So we have a question, or Emily, I'm not sure if you want to comment
Excuse me.
related to graduation requirements.
Yes, hi. This is actually Tristan Zelinka. So,
Tristan.
Hi.
hi, and thank you so much for putting this together, Sarah. I really appreciate this, both from the lens as a parent. So I have a child who has epilepsy, who also has a 504.
Okay.
I'm also a high school counselor. And so I wanted to just add to a little bit piece about that graduation requirement, specifically towards the religious exemption.
Mhm.
In the state of Pennsylvania, parents are permitted to still file for that religious exemption. But with that Act 158 Keystone graduation requirement, students still need to demonstrate readiness to graduate in one of the other pathways.
Mhm.
And so I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. Some of those other pathways are non-starters anyway.
Yeah.
Student takes an SAT, for example, or a PSAT. It's not an issue. But I didn't want anyone to walk away thinking that that religious exemption removes that, because the student still needs to demonstrate proficiency in some capacity.
Right. That's very true. This is actually something, it's interesting you bring that up, that came up today in one of my cases, that, and maybe you can speak to this because it's not something that comes up for me a lot. This is something that, even if, for example, your child is taking the standardized tests, right? And you're not opting them out, but they aren't able to pass them, they're going to have to use one of those alternative methods to graduate. Is there, in your district, and you don't have to tell us which one it is there a time frame that parents are encouraged to be notified when they're going to have to take this alternative track? Because I had a family that's just finding out now that this is an issue, and that's why they're reaching out to me.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
so obviously they're a little panicked, but I think it's going to be okay. But I just wondered if there was kind of general guidance that's provided to schools, because it's not something that's come up for me before
Yeah,
that.
I could at least say locally,
Mhm.
and I graduated college in 2008, and I remember in my first undergrad class them talking about the Keystone exams, and just know that it's going to be a thing one day, and
Yeah,
we're going to have to graduate. And the state does a good job of kicking the can down the
exactly.
road. And I want to say in 2018 is when the rubber hit the road.
Mhm.
And at least from my local district, we started that communication very early, and we continue that communication early with our ninth grade population.
Yeah.
And I will just say from the senior perspective, so that summer from junior to senior year,
Mhm.
my district issues a letter to
Okay.
all families, letting them know what their status is with this Act 158 completion.
Mhm.
We strive to have all of those situations resolved by February, well, by mid-year.
Sure.
But we do what we can, I guess, to kind of meet that. But
Yeah.
say, at least in my local district, we communicate early, and as from that counseling perspective, and I think I'm not the only one, as a school counselor who this has fallen on, I think a lot
Sure.
of us bear that burden of finding the connections for students.
Sure.
And
Sure.
I'll just mention, I can line myself up with this because it makes total sense that students should demonstrate in some capacity
Mhm.
that they're ready to move on in the world.
Yep.
And if that pathway means that you need to secure a full-time job, apply to a community college, kick in some hours of community service, and that will kind of get you on your way,
Mhm.
I can support that, you know?
Yep. Yep. It makes perfect sense. Thank you. That's really helpful. And so for everyone that is listening to that and thinking, I wonder if my child is on track to pass the exams that they need to, or if I should look into this. Um, it I would encourage you to start with the IEP team the next time that you have an IEP meeting, to have a discussion around this, because you should start planning early. It's nice to hear that, even as early as ninth grade, it's something that there's someone in districts they're thinking about. I can honestly say that it's not a conversation that comes up a lot in IEP team meetings that I'm in, but I think that it is likely more so because, um, the students are on the track potentially to take the exams, or they're already thinking that they're not, and there is an alternative plan in place, um, in the transition goal section. But for what it's worth, talk about it openly, honestly, in the IEP team meetings. That can be something and should be something that's built into the transition planning also, if it's not something that the team thinks is reasonable for the student to achieve. So thank you. That's really helpful. Excuse me. So going back to the measurable annual goals, we already talked about it from the transition perspective, kind of broadly, but in the context of the IEP itself, one of the really important sections is the measurable annual goal section, because it's the place where all of the data is going to be captured and where the areas that the student is needing to make progress are included, and where data is then going to be provided to you at least quarterly. The goals, as I talked about, need to be clear. They need to provide you with information that is able to be understood, and it should enable the student to make progress in the general education curriculum. Now, again, goals are intended to allow the student to make progress in all of the different domains of FAPE. So there can be behavior goals, there can be goals surrounding social needs, there can be goals in the areas of occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech and language, which obviously those will look a little bit different than typical math, reading goals as they align with the general education curriculum. But all of those should still result in you receiving progress monitoring data quarterly that will enable you then to go into those IEP team meetings or conversations with teachers and ask, meaningful questions and understand the progress that your son, your daughter, your child is making. And again, it must relate to those identified areas of need that we talked about earlier that are listed explicitly in the IEP. Sorry, living. There we go. Okay. And then the next section in the IEP document, and this is also, we can talk about some overlap with section 504, is the modifications in SDI section, which stands for specially designed instruction. This is where you're also going to see supplementary aids and services included, which are services and supports in the regular education setting that enable children with disabilities to be educated with non-disabled students. So some examples of specially designed instruction would be things listed like extended time, some of the accommodations we mentioned for standardized testing, chunking of assignments, breaks, the positive behavior support plan that a student with some behavioral difficulties that might need, or things like alternate curriculum for students that aren't able to learn just the general education curriculum in the general education setting. You can also add things here like an aide or a paraprofessional or a social skills group, things like that. Assistive technology can be included here. Additionally, you can have things that are more similar to what you would expect to see in a 504 plan. And this is where we get some overlap and where parents will often come and ask an advocate or a lawyer whether their child needs to move from a 504 plan to an IEP. If you start seeing some kind of distinctions, that suggests that you're leaning more towards specially designed instruction as opposed to accommodations. Because remember, accommodations are not intended to change the way that instruction is delivered. They're not intended to modify the curriculum itself. It's to give you access to that standard curriculum. So you will see certain things like extended time and breaks, but you will not see alternate curriculums on a 504 plan. Excuse me. Now, you will also see things sometimes on 504 plans that arguably should be included on an IEP. I have seen school districts recently include things like alternate reading programs on 504 plans. I would discourage parents from, complaining about the inclusion of extra things in a 504 plan. If you are accessing those services in that way, and you are getting pushback from your school district, though, and you feel very strongly, for example, that you need additional specially designed instruction beyond something like a supplementary reading program, and you're starting to see your child removed from the general education setting, then that is the time that you want to start thinking about asking for an evaluation for special education services beyond that 504. Because that's really the distinction that you want to look for, is how much, if any, time are your students spending outside of the regular education setting. If it starts to happen, then you are talking about the need for an IEP as opposed to a 504 plan. Because like I said, if you are getting what your child needs with a 504 and they're adding some extra things and it's not pulling them out of the regular education setting, and you don't have concerns and you don't want to rock the boat too much because you're getting everything that you need from the 504 plan, you are still entitled to the same legal protections with a 504 plan as you are with an IEP as it comes to filing a due process complaint and asking a hearing officer for relief in the state of Pennsylvania. It's not as if you have more legal protections with an IEP than you do a 504 plan. A lot of families ask me that, and that's their concern, which is the only reason I say it's safe to continue with a 504 plan if it is supporting your child's needs. You don't have to push for that IEP just on principle. But if there starts to be a concern about, there's more and more missed time from the general education setting, and you think that there is potentially a need to actually assess whether your child is being educated with their peers as much as they could be, perhaps more supports could actually be pushed into that regular education setting to enable them to be there more. That's the time to start asking for an evaluation to see if special education in the form of an IEP is more appropriate and it looks different than the 504. Okay. This is just, and I have these on the next 2 pages, and I believe, certainly if anyone wants me to send out the PowerPoint, I can, but I believe that that's something that you'll be able to access after this. Just some suggested accommodations that might be appropriate on the next 2 here. Related services, I mentioned a little bit at the beginning, but this is where I wanted to talk about also the inclusion of a separate seizure management plan. Many school districts, in my experience, and this makes perfect sense to be clear, will have a separate seizure management plan for individuals with epilepsy that's not part of the IEP. And it's so they can have that easily accessible places like field trips in the nurse's office, and it can be shared with staff that maybe traditionally don't have access to the IEP, because districts are reluctant to make some of that information public. If it doesn't need to be, with other staff, some things they perceive to be confidential in the IEP. That doesn't mean, though, that you can't push for that seizure plan to also be included in the related services section of the IEP, just so that it is also in that place. And the reason that I suggest that to my clients is just to make sure that someone who is looking for all of the information about your child, for example, if you're moving to another school district or there's a change in the middle of the year, and a teacher goes out on maternity leave and all the paperwork is being transferred, in that IEP, it's all there. That's really it's the building block of the program, that you are providing all of that together in one place. It's worth pushing for it to be there as well. That's my only point. Okay. Now, this is where I wanted to talk about some of the broader concepts too, under the law, just so that if you have any questions, we can hit on those as well. Extended school year. This is programming that districts are required to provide outside of school in the summer for students that meet one of the criteria listed here means automatically you will qualify. But if you are a student, for example, that struggles when there's an interruption of your programming, then an argument can be made for qualifying. That's where we have things like regression or recoupment. That's over long breaks. Then you can qualify. If there was some reason in a particular school year that a student missed a lot of instruction, that's another reason that you can argue a student can qualify, though, too, to be clear. It's not an automatic qualification like these listed here, but it's one of the reasons a school district will consider. What's important to remember, though, is all districts, well, many districts in Pennsylvania now will have their own ESY program on site at one of their buildings or some of their buildings in the summer, but your child does not have to automatically attend that program. Just like during the regular school year, students with disabilities are entitled to access to their least restrictive environment in extended school year as well, which means that if your student is someone who is typically in a program with typical peers in the regular education setting, they can't be sent to a program in the summer where they have no access to regular education peers. That's important to remember. You can ask for other things. And just like during the school year, their goals and things that needs to remain individualized, they have to work on things that will help them continue to make progress, not just what everybody else is working on. And just like I mentioned with extended school year, children with disabilities are entitled to be educated in the least restrictive environment appropriate for them throughout the school year. This means to the maximum extent possible that they are to be included in the general education setting with extra services and supports. Excuse me. I think someone has their hand up.
Yes.
Kristen, we have a question from Colleen.
Perfect.
Hi, just a quick question about the extended school year.
Mhm.
So would the evaluation of eligibility for extended school year take place within what context? Like, is that part of 504 plan and IEP, or like how and when do those conversations usually happen?
It's with the IEP team. Excuse me. There is no explicit extended school year eligibility under Section 504. It's under the IDEA. But the IEP team has to make a determination of if the student is eligible for extended school year in February, typically. By February, I should say. So conversations can happen before that, but by February, they determine eligibility. They'll look at things like, and the reason it's February is they'll look at how the student does after Christmas break, for example, because that's like the biggest break in instruction that they have as an example. See how they do with recoupment, regression, and things during that time. They'll look at data after that. And then the decision as to what program they're going to be in can be determined after February, but the eligibility decision itself has to be done by then.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Okay. Access to all school programs. So there's an overlap here with Section 504 and the IDEA. So Section 504 ensures equal access. It means that every person with a disability has the opportunity to participate in or benefit from educational aids, benefits, or services. Like I have here, it's more than FAPE. It means it applies to transportation, extracurricular activities, graduation. So we talked about field trips. I mentioned field trips earlier. This applies to things like band, sports to the extent that it's safe. And this is for students with IEPs as well as 504 plans, because 504 covers students with IEPs as well. Because the accommodation element is basically, and the legal reason for it isn't something that you need to worry about. The main thing is to understand that it covers it, but 504 accommodations are included in the specially designed instruction section of an IEP. So if your child wants to participate in an extracurricular activity, to the extent that the accommodation being requested is not going to fundamentally alter that program or activity, the school is required to enter into a dialogue with you about that, make that possible. So that is important to remember. There is an unreasonable burden standard that's also included. So one such thing that I have argued with school districts about is air conditioning, because there are some medical conditions, understandably, where they're exacerbated, as you well know, as parents or individuals working with people with epilepsy, can be exacerbated by extreme temperatures. School districts are required to address that, but there is a question of in what way, what type of air conditioning, how many air conditioning units, et cetera, based on that unduly burdensome analysis. So districts can say no to certain things, but there will be a question, and what needs to be argued about sometimes is how far must they go? But they do have to make things safe for students to participate in them, things like transportation, things like extracurricular activities. This is just some tips that I give to families when they're going to participate in an IEP or 504 meeting. Make sure that you have an agenda for yourself in advance so that you can mark off items that you want to discuss throughout the meeting, because sometimes it can get overwhelming. This way you can also make sure that you take note for yourself of the district responses to your specific requests. There is a notice that is provided after IEP team meetings of what was offered and ultimately rejected, or there should be. There are specific circumstances when it's required, when fundamental changes to programming is being made, but smaller requests that wouldn't result in a change in the amount of special education a student's receiving wouldn't result in a formal document being issued by the district, which is why I say write everything down for yourself so you know what you asked for and you know what the district said that they would do or wouldn't do. Any verbal agreements that are made to provide a service or make a change, write it down for yourself. It's just easier to make sure that you remember. And then also note what people participated and if and when they left. Because it's just, again, it's easier, I think, just for peace of mind. But then in the event that you ever have to go back and remember it for any reason, legally, it's good to have notes for yourself. Not that you're ever going to need to get into a situation where you have a lawyer or anything like that, but it's useful for peace of mind. Independent educational evaluations. This is actually my last slide, so we're in good shape, and I'll be able to take questions if you guys have any. But under the law also, school districts are required to evaluate students that they suspect have a disability and need supports in school. If the school does that, though, or you ask for an evaluation and the district refuses, and then, for example, the district does an evaluation and you get it and you disagree with the conclusions, you have the right to request an independent educational evaluation, and the district has to pay for it. And you can go to an evaluator of your choice, so long as they are qualified. They have the credentials required. They're a school psychologist, and they can administer the assessments that you want. And they are assessments that are accepted in a school, right? So if the district refuses to initiate that evaluation, once you ask for it, you can, the district is required to file for due process. In other words, they either have to say yes or they have to defend their own evaluation to a hearing officer and say that it's appropriate. Again, you can select the evaluator, and then that person provides you with a report that is shared with the district that provides information that the IEP team is supposed to consider, required to consider, and either incorporate into the IEP itself or give an indication as to why that is not credible information that they should include and incorporate into the document. So it's a good resource to have. And there are, I'm sure that this organization or offices like mine, other advocacy organizations can provide you with lists of evaluators that are really good that can be used in situations like that. But it's just an important resource to know that as parents, you can pursue that. So with that, does anyone have any other questions?
If you have a question and you don't want to ask it, if you type it in the chat, we will read it. Or you can use the raise your hand function, and we'll give you the chance to ask your question. All right, well, Sabrina, I'm going to unmute you, or you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, hello. Thank you for the presentation. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sabrina.
I have a question about the field trip. So my daughter has epilepsy and an IEP and all that, and she has approved van transportation to and from school, due to some other special needs as well. But the main thing is this year would be our first experience in her going on a field trip with her grade level. Right now she's in the like an LIU kind of alternative program, but she goes out with her peers. So they had said that they don't have a nurse available for that field trip, that daddy or mommy would have to volunteer, which we are completely okay with.
Mhm.
But I'm just trying to be proactive because, you know, things happen. We have a younger sibling, I work, and
Sure.
you know, in case we couldn't make it, in case one of us was sick or whatever the circumstances may be, how would we go about having that conversation of, well, would she miss the field trip because we can't go?
Right.
You know, I don't know. This would be our first experience with that. So
Yeah. So does she, if you don't mind my asking, does she
Sure.
have to have a nurse with her all day, or is it just that because there's a nurse in the building and there wouldn't be a nurse on the field trip?
yes, so there's only there's a nurse in the building. She doesn't have a private nurse in school or at home.
Okay.
We're basically her aide.
Mhm. Sure. So my take on that is that they have to have a nurse available on the field trip. They
Okay.
can't make you go. The challenge is if they don't agree to that in advance, your only option is to push. You would need to escalate it beyond the school, right? You would either have to
Right.
go to mediation or a due process hearing. You
Okay.
shouldn't have to, though. I mean,
Yeah.
districts, it's not a good idea not to have a nurse available at all.
Agreed. I mean,
Um,
I don't know because even she's never been on a field trip before. She's our oldest kid, and you know, I figure so that even
Mhm.
for other kids, if in case there's an injury or something, I don't know. You know,
Right.
other kids that might not be in the same circumstances, but yeah, I'm just thinking of like, what if that morning we just can't make it, and we don't feel she should miss out on the
Yeah.
field
Now
trip because of
if it's the day of,
yeah,
you're not going to be in a situation where they're going to get somebody that day. Like that,
yeah.
you have to have a pre-planned situation.
Okay,
Like, sure.
so that would probably be better to try to work because the field trip's in a couple of months. So maybe we'll just have that conversation with her
Yes.
teacher, who we're very comfortable and
Yes.
communicative with, and say, hey, you know, what if something happens and we
Yeah.
want to have a backup, so she could be included.
Yes.
You know, we don't want her to be excluded,
That's a really
and
good
I'm
idea.
sure that her teachers would agree. But we just
Mhm.
this again our first experience.
Yeah,
So
that's a really good
okay,
idea. I would talk to this, yeah, and I think the fact that they're already talking to you about it means that they want to
yeah,
work with you too. So I think you're going to
exactly.
be able to work it out for sure. But
Okay,
if you have, the short answer is if you have a plan and it falls apart the day of because of
right,
unforeseen circumstances, there's not going
yeah,
to be any action you can take there, right?
right,
Because those things unfortunately happen. And
right,
the plan that you and the district came up with was it was going to be you guys, which is great. And that sometimes
yeah,
is the best plan because if she
right,
doesn't need a private nurse, might be a good idea for it to be
right.
both one of you. Um, then we can't blame a school district for something that's outside of everybody's control at the
Of
last,
course. Yeah.
That's a good question. It's a good
Thank
question.
you.
Mhm,
Appreciate it.
absolutely.
Take care.
You too.
So we had a comment in the chat. Colleen Hooper was going to ask the same question.
Oh,
And she has accompanied her son in the past because they said a nurse was not available.
yeah.
So if this becomes a consistent thing, like they
Yes.
keep saying
Right.
there's no nurse available, what, as a parent, what can people try to do?
The first thing that I would do is I would reach out to, well, the first thing I would do is I would recommend reaching out to PDE, honestly, because I think if it's an issue in your district in general that they keep telling parents consistently, we don't provide nurses for field trips. So that means that anybody in your district that needs a nurse doesn't get to go on field trips. And if you're a working parent, that means your kid never gets to go on a field trip. That's something that the Pennsylvania Department of Education would not look at kindly. And you shouldn't need to get a lawyer, or you could get an advocate to try to talk to the district for you. But that suggests that there's some kind of systemic problem in your district where they're not taking the issue of access to field trips seriously. And it's probably happening to a lot of people. And PDE, that's their job, is to look into issues like that and address them, right? It's not going to be instant though, you know. But if you've exhausted the option of having the conversation with the IEP team, and if you are uncomfortable, understandably, you don't have to do it, but filing a request with the Office of Dispute Resolution to do a mediation with a neutral third party trying to figure that out. Because sometimes the issue really is, and this is not an acceptable answer, but that there are just not resources. They don't have nurses. They're not saying no because they don't think you need it. They just don't have them. They need someone like PDE to come in and tell them they have no choice but to do this. And then they have to allocate the resources, right? So it's not because, and this is, I mean, 99% of the time, this is why schools are saying no to stuff, right? It's not because they are malicious about things. It's that there is a lack of resources or a lack of understanding about what the requirement is. So PDE is not a bad solution. You can call them and you can file a complaint over the phone, and they will look into it in your district.
Thank you so much. I just had one quick follow-up, which is for my son's IEP, which is in progress. I had them do a plan, like if the nurse is not there, you know, what if the nurse is unavailable that day and my son needs his emergency medication? So they had additional people at the school who have been trained on the emergency medicine, which is just a nasal at this point, at this stage. So I guess my last part of the question is, you know, is it appropriate to request that someone who is trained on the medication, given my son's situation, could accompany a field trip? Does it have to be a nurse? I guess that's more for them to figure out.
No,
But
that's absolutely, if it's not a situation where your child has a private nurse, right? And so it's a nurse that's the requirement, then absolutely you can ask for that secondary option, right? Because the challenge is, and all of you know this even better than I do, right, is that we start talking about medications that are controlled substances when we talk about epilepsy too. So sometimes school districts get really nervous about who's holding this medication, who's doing this with the medication, who's doing that. If you have a school that's already agreed to get certain people trained beyond a nurse to administer a medication, then there's no reason why you don't ask that district to also send one of those other people with you. That's perfectly reasonable. It's just that sometimes you have a district that is not willing to take that step already, you know. But so in your circumstance, I'd say for sure, that's a very reasonable step. And there's nothing, if you are not in a circumstance where the issue is that the IEP says you are entitled to a nurse with you, and they're saying, we just don't have a nurse, that you can't ask for something as an alternative.
So there's some conversations in the chat related to the rescue medications.
Yep.
So currently in Pennsylvania, it in the school system, it has to be a nurse
Right.
that administers all medications.
Yeah.
So I know that creates a struggle for some families related to their emergency medication.
Absolutely.
That it has to be a nurse. So a bus driver can't administer
Right.
it, you know, all these different things. Although I know there is talk, I don't know how. Amanda has said there's a proposed bill for inhaled rescue meds to be provided, but it's not passed yet.
Yeah.
So
I've heard some districts that are willing to keep the medication locked in the classroom, though, for the nurse to administer, so it's closer.
Oh,
Because the parent had concerns about if the nurse is not with the medication at the time that she would need to come and
right.
administer it, can we at least have that? Because they were concerned about it being in the nurse's office and it being far away and like that extra step, which makes perfect sense. So while that's what I mean when I say there's a lot of arguments around it,
Right.
you're absolutely right. They can't not be the one to do it, but it made sense to keep it in the room with the kid.
And I just want to ask a question or surrounding that as well, because I know I've gone into a lot of schools to do presentations and was told by parents and by staff that there isn't a nurse on staff
Right.
full time. So
Yep.
how do parents go around that? Because obviously you want a nurse on grounds in case of emergency medication. Is there a way for parents to get that nurse on site? Is that legally allowed to not have a nurse on site when you have kids with emergency medication and things like that? Because I've seen it a lot and I
Yeah.
don't have answers for parents.
Yeah, so there's not an easy answer, which is not something I like to say. But the reason for that is it is legal, broadly speaking, when we're not talking about students that have, like, just period. If we're not talking about kids that need emergency medication, schools are allowed to not have a nurse in every building, which is wild.
Yeah.
However, the thing that I recommend to parents is get a letter of medical necessity, because that is a hard thing for a school to deal with from the IEP perspective. Because if you have a doctor that's saying there needs to be a nurse able to administer this medication within X amount of time, and the IEP either doesn't write that in, knowing that that's required, you can go to a hearing officer and they're going to say you have to do this. And then that means by necessity, the IEP is going to require there to be a nurse in that building because physically it's impossible for them to get there otherwise, right? Or a letter of medical necessity that says something even more direct. Like usually doctors are unwilling to say, understandably, like they have to be in this building, but they'll write something like they have to be able to administer this medication within X amount of time. And that necessitates the nurse being in the building.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
But yeah, I know that it was, it's been several years, but Pittsburgh Public was sued,
Yep.
you know.
And that's one of the ones that I see over and over, that they have one nurse for 5 to 6 different schools.
Yeah.
And still dealing with that. So if they've if they
Yeah.
haven't figured it out.
Yeah. They'll just do one-on-one nurses. That's the other thing. I mean, to the extent that your doctor will say that they need a one-on-one nurse, then the district gives you one, but it obviously doesn't solve the problem for everybody else.
Does anyone in our participants have any other questions for Kristen?
And also I don't know if my email was on anything. I'm glad to add it to the chat right now. If anyone ever needs to get in touch with me, I am always glad to help. I don't know.
Dom said in the chat, do you have any thoughts on the removal of the Department of Education and IEPs if it happens?
I have so many thoughts.
I figured.
Hours worth of thoughts. So I will start by saying because we have the Pennsylvania Department of Education, I am more hopeful than I think that other states probably are. Because even if something would happen with the Department of Education, the regulations, we have separate codified requirements in the state that protect students with disabilities, just like the IDEA in Section 504. If you want to look at Chapter 14 and Chapter 15 of Chapter 15 is sort of abysmal in terms of looking at it. It's a little confusing, but Chapter 15 is where we have Section 504 codified in Pennsylvania. Chapter 14 is the IDEA. So we have state protections too. So we should be cautiously optimistic about how quickly it would impact our students here. That said, the other piece is the laws and the courts wouldn't go away. The protections that are there are statutory. The only question would be the funding source. How quickly what would happen? But I will also tell you that there are large groups of people already mobilizing to answer these questions. I was in an advocacy group discussion this afternoon. I'm in another one next week. People are moving to be ready to protect families right now and come up with creative arguments to make sure that other things could immediately be done. But I talked to someone much older than me that practiced before some of these statutes were in place recently. You know his wife well. And he reminded me that, we did it then and we can do it again. This community of people, parents of children with disabilities, adults with disabilities, people that care about those people, we are not going away. And just because a group of people that don't understand that try to take one named entity and move it to some other space isn't going to change all of the things that we've done or stop us from doing the things that we're doing. So I think we will be okay, just we might have to work in a different way than we do right now.
Thank you, Kristen. It looks like we have one more question that we didn't discuss in the chat. Someone said, if we have field trips that go skiing, how do we handle that with the nurse? They said, we send a nurse, but how do we handle when we're unable to be with them, such as on the ski lift?
Oh, that is a great question.
A great field trip too.
Yeah,
I know, right?
So no one's ever asked me that before. That would be, you would need to make some you'd have to have important discussions with the nurse about their level of comfort with the skiing. Truly. Because I mean, that's, if you send a nurse that can't do it, right? I mean, now we're talking about, you can't add extra criteria to a nurse like that. Like you can't say the nursing job is contingent upon your ability to ski, right?
Right.
Like not, I mean, in all seriousness. So like there would need to be plans put in place for that trip so the nurse could be safely within distance to administer whatever would need to be administered while not also having to be able to ski. So, but I would honestly, in all those circumstances, the one thing I always say is I would talk to the medical professionals you're working with and say, where would you recommend the nurse be? What's safe in this situation? And then work with the nurse from there because your doctor is going to know, the people working with you and your family are going to know what's safe for your child to be able to live their life the way that they want to live it. And also to work within the medical system. And nobody's going to expect nurses to be skiing with your kid, but they want them to be there to support them as they do it. So they can probably tell you what's reasonable. How close do they need to be? Can they be at the bottom of the hill? Do they have to be at the top of the hill and then the bottom of the hill? Does that mean, I mean, anybody can ride a ski lift. So do they just ride the ski lift up and down with them? I would ask the doctor, and then the doctor, in the same way that you get a letter of medical necessity, I'd get a doctor to write something that explains how they need to participate. And then you're going to get into those issues of, is this a reasonable accommodation? Truly, because we're starting to talk about additions to the role of nurse that are above and beyond what the medical profession expects to be doing. But depending on the nurse, honestly, you might have somebody that's really excited about it. So it might work out great. But you have to be prepared to have those accommodation related discussions too, if they can't find somebody who is able to fulfill those extra pieces, because that really wouldn't be, an expected responsibility of a nurse.
Absolutely.
That's a good question though. No one's ever asked me that before. So that's.
Oh, and someone put in the chat, there's emergency responders generally at ski resorts as well.
So that would definitely be helpful in those
That's a really good
situations too.
Mhm. Does anyone else have any other questions? Feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand.
So as you're thinking about it, if you have any questions, I reposted the link to the survey / short little tiny quiz for those of you who maybe are looking for Act 48 credits. If you're not looking for Act 48 credits, again, we encourage you to fill out our post survey, can provide us with feedback. And just real quickly before we go to that last question, since we've been talking about emergency medications and school nurses, any chance you may have to try to advocate for that bill to be passed, that it doesn't have to be a nurse to administer medications in the school system would be fantastic. Any chance you have, part of the reason for those nasal sprays to be developed was so that it would be easy to administer by other people. So we do have a question about recommendations for communicating with summer camps. Colleen, do you want to give us any more information about what exactly you're asking there?
Yeah, I guess just this group just seems to have a lot of great information. I mean, fortunately, my son's epilepsy is well controlled, so he's able to do a lot, but just learning more about emergency medicines and I don't know, I just didn't know if there were resources that I could look at or things that you all could recommend because he is able to do a lot. And obviously a summer camp is very different than a school setting, but yeah, I was just curious. I just reinvent the wheel every day. So I didn't know if anyone had any had any recommendations.
But just before Kristen
Emergency
answers,
medicine.
You guys have a great camp.
that's what I was going to mention. We actually have our program called Camp Frog, which is our summer camp specifically designed for teens with epilepsy, where we have neurologists and nurses on site. So there is no worry about that. And it's also in with normal everyday summer camps as well. So we are not off on our own. Our summer camp kids are with all the other summer camp kids. The only difference is they have additional resources on site for our kids. So if you're looking for a summer camp specifically designed to support your child, you can also look into our Camp Frog program as well.
And one thing we as an agency can do, we can provide training at summer camps for staff as well as other campers about seizure first aid and recognition and things like that. So I don't know, Kristen, if you have any suggestions or advice otherwise related to summer camps.
Yeah, I mean the requirements for summer camps, so long as the tough thing about the things we talked about today is laws related to the application of accommodations and things only apply to entities that accept federal funds. So whether or not they have to do all of the things we talked about under Section 504 will be dictated by that. However, if you're looking at camps and they advertise themselves as being disability friendly and all of those things, you want to look for those because then they will typically have a commitment to do those things. And then if that is the case and that's the contractual obligation that they're offering to you, then you can ask them to provide all of the things in a seizure plan and that sort of thing because they're committed to doing it. But you just want to be careful. That's why I immediately mentioned their Camp Frog, because it's unfortunate, but absent that federal funding piece or that requirement, especially now, as much as I'm not a doom and gloomer. If you couldn't tell, I'm a proactive, we're going to make changes, we're going to keep things going in the right direction. But unfortunately, absent a requirement to do the right thing, I'm not sure that everybody's going to. So I'd look for places that are explicitly providing the supports already, or work with the team here to have trainings done with staff at a place that you trust because they're advertising themselves as an entity that's committed to inclusion and disability support.
Great. Thank you so much. That's really helpful.
Anybody else? Excuse me, man.
So Kristen has put her email address in the chat for anybody who wants it. If you miss it and decide later, oh shoot, I should have written that down, just reach out to me or Megan, and we will be happy to connect you.
Absolutely. And we want to thank you again, Kristen, for joining us tonight. Your presentation was incredibly meaningful and helpful. And thank you for giving your time and especially getting over your sickness. We appreciate you. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, everyone. It was a lot of fun.